Divided World, Divided Class. Part 4. Marxism or Euro-Marxism. Beginning of quote by James Connolly. And finally, let us say that we are sick of the canting talk of those who tell us that we must not blame the British people for the crimes of their rulers against Ireland. We do blame them, insofar as they support the system of society which makes it profitable for one nation to connive at the subjection of another nation. They are responsible for every crime committed to maintain that subjection. End quote. The inescapable conclusion of the present work is that the core nation working class is not exploited, but subsists in no small measure upon surplus value created by workers in the oppressed nations. It is to that extent what Engels called a, quote, bourgeois working class, that is, a labor aristocracy. Surplus value is the lifeblood of capitalism, and so long as workers in the core nation countries were creating it, their objective class interests lay in the socialist promise of an end to exploitation. The 19th century workers at the core of the world economy provided the bulk of that cheaper and more profuse relative surplus value fundamental to capitalist accumulation, even as their wages were supplemented by values pillaged from the peasants and the workers of the economically backward colonial periphery. Yet, as the industries of the core nations developed into world-conquering imperialist oligopolies, the repatriation of surplus value from foreign direct investments and unequal exchange became pivotal. Although initially guaranteeing prestigious jobs for a privileged upper stratum of workers, super-exploited workers in the extroverted capitalist industries of the dependent economies would increasingly have to foot the bill for the rising wages of the First World workforce, a sine qua non for the expansion of the advanced capitalist production cycle. When in recent decades the amount of superprofits in the world economy exceeded the surplus value produced by First World workers as a whole, the class interests of the latter could no longer be said to align with the socialist project. Despite intermittent conflict over its share of superprofits, the class interests of the labor aristocracy closely line up with those of the haute bourgeoisie, which dominates the world system through its control of third world land, labor, and markets. Expressed in political terms, these class interests are imperialist, racist, patriarchal, and eminently conservative. The economic position of the bourgeoisie is maintained through outright aggression or by proxy war against democracy and democratic leadership in the Third World. And it is this which largely accounts for the enormous disparity in living conditions between the core and the peripheral nations. Our argument contrasts with those authors who situate the bourgeois reformism of the imperialist country labor movement purely at the national level. Greek Marxist sociologist Nikos Poulantzas, for example, argues that the labor movements in Britain, France, and Germany have historically been hampered, 1. by the acceptance of political ideologies inherited from their respective bourgeoisies' transition to power, and 2. by their respective states' hegemonic strategies of political co-optation. Thus, in Britain, the fact that the bourgeoisie came to power via the ascendancy of a fraction of the nobility has produced a distinctly apolitical trade unionist consciousness, which has neglected to concentrate on the state as the site of struggle over class dominion. In Germany, what Poulantzas referred to as Lassallism, that is, the belief that the state is a class-neutral body that can be converted to proletarian ends with due pressure, has been influential as a reflection of the centrality of state regulation to the emerging capitalist economy there. Finally, we might add, in the United States, white nationalism may be said to have infiltrated the working class as a politico-ideological reflex of the racist structures of capitalism as it has existed in that society. At the same time, Palatsas argues convincingly that state guarantees of working-class living standards and political influence help consolidate and maintain existing structures of bourgeois hegemony. While such arguments are important and valuable, we consider it vital to emphasize that bourgeois tendencies within the labor movement are ultimately predicated on the ability of the bourgeoisie to afford bourgeois living standards to a fraction of the workforce. Ideology, both reflecting and obscuring the dominant class relations of a society, is only meaningful where it interacts with lived experience. Historically, the consistently conservative, reformist fraction of the international working class, residing in the imperialist countries, has been afforded its privilege only through the extended subjection of an oppressed and superexploited workforce. With these points made, we may now offer a brief overview of the pro-imperialist trajectory of the labor aristocracy in Britain, the USA, and Germany. We are forced to conclude that a pro-imperialist working class may be both unable and unwilling to forestall the growth of fascism. End of introduction.